ledige plasser litt sånn foran her også. Bare... Ja, hei, og velkommen til frokostseminar om verdien av innovasjon og kreativitet. Veldig hyggelig å se så mange mennesker tidlig en mandag morgen i fellesferien til og med. Jeg tenker det sier jo litt om at kreativitet og innovasjon er begreper som vi synes er spennende. Alle er vel kanskje enige om at innovasjon, det er bra, det trenger vi. Men når man ser litt nærmere på hva man faktisk legger i begrepet innovasjon, så blir det litt vanskeligere igjen. For hva er det vi egentlig snakker om? Er vi sikre på at vi snakker om det samme? Vi i Tinker driver med det vi kaller kreativitetsdrevet innovasjon, som bygger på et premiss om at kreativitet, det kan effektiviseres, og det kan struktureres. Og vi ser kreativitet som en helt sentral del av et hvert innovasjonsarbeid. I utviklingen av vårt metodiske rammeverk så bruker vi et nettverk av anerkjente forskere på kreativitet og innovasjon. Og 2 av de er vi så heldige å ha med oss i dag, og de vil da snakke litt om det vitenskapelige grunnlaget for denne kreativitetsdrevne innovasjonen. Men før vi slipper de til, så skal Christian, som er daglig leder i Tinker, snakke litt om de mytene som omgir kreativitet og innovasjon. For der er det en del misoppfatninger og feiloppfatninger som kanskje gjør arbeidet vi driver med innovasjon litt vanskeligere. Så Christian?
Hei. Ja, det var jo ikke verst. Jeg fikk ikke applaus, men et lite hei, det. Jeg sier det er en god start. Jeg synes det er utrolig morsomt å se at det er så mange her. Jeg bor jo i Vadsø, en liten by oppe på Finnmarkskysten. Så dette her er jo for meg veldig, veldig mange folk som kommer og hører, og jeg har lyst til å høre på meg snakke litt om innovasjon og kreativitet, og ikke minst forskerne. Og jeg synes jo det er utrolig morsomt at vi får lov til å ha med oss disse forskerne våre. At dere får lov til at dere også får lov til å ta del i det de forsker på, og få høre hva de har å melde. Og det som er viktig er jo at vi får satt innovasjon på agendaen. Eller som en fritt valgt politiker ville sagt, nå må vi få satt innovasjon på agendaen! Som om det var problemet. Som om det at vi skal sette innovasjon på agendaen er det store problemet. Apropos myter, dette er jo en myte. Vi har jobbet litt med innovasjon i kommunal sektor. Og tror dere at det er noen av de i kommunal sektor som tenker sånn, ja, jeg ser det kommer til å bli mange pensjonister, vi får mindre og mindre penger og mer kravstore brukere, dette kommer til å gå helt greit. Så jobber vi med humanitær sektor, de som jobber med flyktningekrisa. Det har aldri vært så mange flyktninger i verden som det er nå, og det blir stadig mindre penger. Er det noen som tror at de sitter og tenker sånn, ja, men det kommer sikkert til å gå greit. Selvfølgelig gjør det ikke det. Det er ikke den selskapsstrategi som vi har sett, hvor det ikke på et eller annet vis står at innovasjon er viktig. Og sikkert i aller fleste styrerom så har det vært en eller annen som har sagt at ja, vi må innovere, ellers så dør vi. Dette er jo ikke problemet. Problemet er at man vet ikke hva man skal gjøre. Alle sier at innovasjon er viktig, men det er veldig få som vet hva de skal gjøre. Hvis du leser forskningsrapportene på innovasjon i offentlig sektor, så sier du jo det. Ja, alle er enige om at dette er viktig, men vi får ikke til en systematisk og strukturert satsing på innovasjon. Vi ser det i kommunesektoren, vi ser at vi får det ikke til. I humanitær sektor, akkurat det samme. Og når vi snakker med bedriftsledere i ulike bedrifter, så sier de, ja, det er veldig greit å sitte på styrerommet og si at innovasjon er viktig, men hvordan skal vi operasjonalisere det? Hva skal vi helt konkret gjøre for å få det til? Og da er jo situasjonen den at ja, da må man jo finne ut hva man skal gjøre. Og en ekstra utfordring knyttet til dette er jo ikke bare at vi ikke vet hva vi skal gjøre, men vi vet jo masse som er feil. Altså, det masse myter der ute rundt innovasjon generelt, men kreativitet spesifikt, som gjør at vi tar de feil valga. Og når vi så dette, så tenkte vi jo i vår naivitet, så tenkte vi, ja, hvem det som kan hjelpe oss med det? Ja, David Copley, han var en av verdens fremste kreativitetsforskere, han må jo kunne hjelpe oss med dette. Og så sendte vi han en mail, og i hans naivitet så sa han, ja, det vil jeg gjerne være med dere på. Så derfor, det jo dette vi bruker forskerne til. Vi sier, det utrolig mye kunnskap der ute om innovasjon og kreativitet, og vi veldig usikre på hva dette rett, og hva det feil. Og vi må vite det for å kunne satse riktig på kreativitet og innovasjon. Er vi enige? Ja, bra. Det var veldig godt. Det en god start. Ok, så hva disse mytene da? Ja, det mange, det veldig mange myter. Jeg tenkte jeg skulle ta 3 og bare liksom touche innom dem så vidt. La oss da kalle det myte 1. Myte 1. Kreativitet bare lek og kaos. Jeg, og sikkert noen her, og i hvert fall veldig mange i samfunnet, har jo ofte følt at dette kreativitetsgreiene egentlig, jeg skjønner at det viktig, men jeg har liksom tenkt at jeg har ikke egentlig så veldig lyst til å holde på med det. Jeg føler meg ikke så veldig komfortabel med å ligge på gulvet og leke fruktsalat og finne ut om jeg en ananas, og da finne den som passer og sånn. Nei, det ikke meg. Altså, og jeg har liksom følt at jeg har vært på et sånn kreativitetsforedrag, så har jeg liksom følt at det et sånn selvutviklingsprosjekt. Som om de skal fortelle meg at ja, du gjør det ikke på riktig måte, du må være en helt annen person, du må være så livlig og glad. Og det, ja. Og så jeg tenkte at det jo ikke meg, men jeg skjønner jo at kreativitet viktig. Det skjønner jeg, men dette skjønner jeg ikke. Og det mange sikkert som har kommet tilbake fra liksom 2-dagsseminar, og så har de lekt Al Capone og onkel Skrue, og så har de bruke det som en kreativ verktøy, for at de skal liksom komme frem til geniale ideer, og så kommer de tilbake og tenker seg at dette egentlig så veldig mye, egentlig. Hva får jeg igjen av dette her? Egentlig! Og de har jo da rett, mange av dem, blant annet jeg og jeg da. For når vi da snakker med forskerne, hva sier de? Ja, sier de at det sånn man må være kreativ? Nei, de sier jo ikke det. De sier jo, ja, vi hører at alle sier at kreativitet kaos. Og dette ikke bare vi, altså i forskningsverdenen nå. Innovasjonskonsulenter, innovasjonsteoretikere sier jo, vi kan si ganske mye om innovasjon, men den første fasen, the fuzzy front-end som de kaller det, ja, det kan vi ikke si noe om, for der det bare kaos. Det kreativitetsgreiene, det kan vi ikke noe om. Men kreativitetsforskerne våre sier jo snarere tvert imot. Nei. Kreativitet, det jo struktur. Det svært strukturert, og dere kommer til å se det etterpå når de skal presentere. Her følger vi helt konkrete strukturer. Ja, og ok, det greit, det interessant, men har det verdi? Ja, fordi at hvis myten at kreativitet kaos, ja, da kan man jo ikke satse strukturert på kreativitet. Man kan ikke lage en kreativitetsstrategi hvis det bare kaos, for man kan ikke operere i kaos. Usikkerhet, det klarer vi å forholde oss til, men ikke kaos. Så gjennom å få en systematisk og strukturert tilnærming til kreativitet, så kan vi gå inn og jobbe med, vi blant annet Markus her, har vi blant annet jobbet med en del kulturaktører, kunstnere, og gått gjennom og sett på deres kreative prosess, og analysert den og satt stegvis og sett, ok, hvordan gjør du de ulike stegene? Kunne du blitt bedre gjennom å forbedre et av disse stegene? Ja, da plutselig begynner du å få verdi. Vi kan jo begynne å satse strukturert på at vi skal få en bedre kreativ prosess. For alle enige om at kreativitet viktig innovasjon. Det bare det at de færreste vet hvordan de skal klare å strukturere den prosessen så de får verdi. Myte 2. Idéarbeid lett. Den implementeringen som vanskelig. Ja, det på en måte rett da. Det ikke så vanskelig å få ideer. Alle får ideer, det ikke det som problemet. Men det heller ikke det som problemet med myten. Forskning viser at tidlig fase innovasjonsprosess, altså innsikts- og idéfasen, når den ferdig, når du har gjort valget ditt, så har du definert 70% av kostnadsstrukturen i dette innovasjonsprosjektet. Så 70% av kostnadene har du definert. Du har definert hele inntjeningspotensialet, fordi du har valgt den ideen, og den ideen har et inntjeningspotensiale. Og du vet at etter den fasen, så vil en endring i prosjektet vil koste deg 10 ganger mer per fase du går i innovasjonsprosessen. Litt avhengig av hvordan faser du bruker, men la oss nå holde det til siden foreløpig. Ok? Det betyr at innsikts- og idéfasen altså helt avgjørende, selvsagt, for et hvert innovasjonsprosjekt. Så gikk vi inn og jobbet med noen av kundene våre, og så vi på innovasjonsprosessen deres. Og så vi hvor mye ressurser bruker de i de ulike fasene i innovasjonsprosessen. Dette var et prosjekt på rundt 5,5 million. Og hvor stor prosentandel av 5,5 million brukte de, eller prosentandel da det samme, hvor stor prosentandel brukte de på tidlig fase? 2,3%. Altså de brukte 2,3% av det totale prosjektbudsjettet på de aktivitetene som definerte 70% av kostnadene, 100% av inntjeningspotensialet, og som gjorde det som helt avgjørende i forhold til å gjøre endringer på prosjektet. Det ikke formålstjenlig. Det fører jo til at fordi at man tror at idéarbeid lett, så fører det til at man ikke tar de riktige beslutningene. Man får ikke valgt de riktige prosjektene. Det ikke det å lage ideer som vanskelig, det det å finne de beste ideene, de som du skal implementere. Det der verdien ligger. Siste myte. Det feil vi lærer mest av. Det også i og for seg riktig. Vi lærer jo veldig mye av potensielt lærer vi veldig mye av feila. Utfordringen jo at hvis man tror at det bare sånn, at man bare skal feile, som vi jo ser i en del organisasjoner, ja, så klarer man jo ikke å få hentet ut verdien av dette her. I dette prosjektet, hvor mye penger tror du de brukte på evalueringsfasen? Dere kan jo tenke selv, fra deres egne prosjekter. Hvor stor del av det totale prosjektbudsjettet bruker dere på evalueringsfasen? 1%. Ja, altså vi bruker ingenting. Feiling gir mulighet, potensialet for mye læring. Men hvis du ikke har systemer og strukturer for å fange opp læringa, ja, så gir det ingenting. Da feiling bare galt, rett og slett. Du kan feile riktig og samle verdien av feilinga di. Ja, da vil det plutselig være svært verdifullt. Men har du ikke et system for det, ja, da skal du ikke feile. Da må du være helt sikker på at du lykkes. Dette noen av de mytene som vi har jobbet med, og mange flere som de skal jo fortelle dere litt mer om dette her. Og det som at disse mytene fører jo da til at når det blir gjennomført en undersøkelse blant bedriftsledere internasjonalt på verdien av innovasjon, så sa jo alle at innovasjon helt avgjørende for selskapet mitt, og 50% av bedriftslederne sa, men jeg føler ikke egentlig at jeg får så mye igjen for den innovasjonsaktiviteten jeg gjennomfører. Jeg føler ikke at det genererer penger på bunnlinja. Dette jo den store utfordringen. Det dette vi må få gjort noe med. Og da ville det vel være litt naivt å tro at jeg og mine medarbeidere i Tinker kunne løse dette på egen hånd. Så det jo derfor da vi har fått med disse forskerne. Så vi har fått med da, og jo så heldige at vi har faktisk flere av verdens ledende kreativitetsforskere med oss på laget. Og det utrolig spennende å jobbe sammen med dem og høre på alle funnene deres og hvordan de jobber med kreativitet. Og nå skal altså dere få muligheten til å få et lite innblikk i det som disse forskerne forsker på. Takk!
And I think we'll then switch to English so that our researcher also actually understands what we're talking about. But we've been discussing these issues with them during this past week. And I think what Christian exited on is a good entry point to David Cropley's research that he will share with us today. David is assistant professor at the University of South Australia. And he has been doing research on innovation for how many years? 20 years. So he is a leading figure in the field of innovation research. And I think rather than me trying to explain what your research actually is about, I would just like to invite you up to the stage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. So, hi. That's all my Norwegian, I'm afraid. In fact, I know tak as well, but we were preparing our slides yesterday, and I prepared mine on my laptop and then gave them to Marcus, and it reminded me of a friend of mine once was like an executive assistant to a very senior manager. and used to prepare his talks for him on index cards. And once, just before he left the job, he wasn't really getting on well with this guy, so he thought he'd prepare a little trick for him. And partway through the talk, the cards just stopped and they were blank. And then the guy turned over the next one and it said, "What are you going to do now?" And so I'm kind of slightly afraid that I'm going to be partway through and Marcus will just have put in a blank slide saying, good luck now, you're going to have to improvise. So I'm just going to turn around and make sure that there we go. So as Miriam said, I'm David Cropley. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Australia, and I'm actually, I work in the School of Engineering. So my day job, so to speak, is teaching engineering. And I got into creativity and innovation almost by accident, but have been working in that area for the last 20 years. And in fact, you realise, I'm sure, that it makes more sense than you might think at first, because really the essence of engineering is design. And design is all about solving new problems with new solutions, which means it's creativity. Implementing those solutions means it's innovation. So engineering is really a very good example of creativity and innovation in practice. Some of the concepts I'm going to tell you about also are very psychological in nature, and you might say, well, what's an engineer doing talking about psychology? The explanation there is that my entry into working in creativity was in collaboration with my father. I think Christian maybe mentioned that. I can hear the occasional word in Norwegian and pick it up. And my father's a professor of psychology and was specializing in creativity before I was born. So we kind of formed this accidental collaboration, and I've been his pupil, if you like, over the last 20 years and picked up a lot of the psychology of creativity. But let me get on with the main topic. So what I want to do is talk about the why and the how of innovation. And I really want to talk about three things. Sorry, I might take this out because I'm going to point and move around a little bit. So I want to talk about three things first of all. Firstly, why do we innovate? Secondly, how do we innovate? And then lastly, I want to talk about how we measure innovation. And I'm going to do this at a fairly sort of high level view, looking at the driving forces and the kind of core concepts behind innovation in particular. Ronnie Ryder-Powman later on will talk about some of the more detail and specific aspects of things like teams and innovation. So to move straight into that, there are three elements in terms of why we need to innovate, what drives innovation. I like to tell people that change is the basic driver of innovation, and I'll explain what I mean in a second. Then I'll tell you about the fact that incremental and radical innovation together are really the ingredients of sustained growth for an organization. And that's whether we mean growth in terms of profit or growth in terms of how we satisfy our stakeholder needs. And the third element I'll tell you about then is why new problems require new solutions. So several kind of high-level concepts that really help us to understand the driving force behind innovation. This particular diagram here, I normally sort of spend a bit of time stepping through it, but I want to move through it a little bit more quickly today, just to kind of give you a flavor of some of the key concepts. Now, I like to say that innovation is driven by change. Sorry, I realize I'm hiding from the camera as well back here. So, innovation is driven by change. Now, when I say change, I mean literally any change, like climate change or economic change or demographic change or even government and regulatory change. And those changes have two effects. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, ultimately they give rise to new problems. So if you take the example of climate change is a concern. It gives rise to market pull or customer demands. For example, people have a desire for cleaner air travel. Ultimately, that defines a new problem. For example, how can an airline reduce its fuel consumption or reduce its emissions? So on the one hand, change drives new problems. And that's probably the more common pathway. But on the other hand, there is also this pathway of technology push that sometimes people come up with new solutions more or less out of the blue. An example following the climate change example is winglets. You've all seen the little turned up ends of wings on modern aircraft now. There's the Boeing version and the Airbus version. And that was basically invented just as a piece of technology, and then they found that they could apply it to things like the problem of climate change and reducing fuel costs. So change gives rise to two things. It causes new problems to be defined, and it sometimes leads to new solutions. But the key point of this is that organizations are in the business of connecting those two things together. Organizations connect new problems to new solutions. And the primary pathway is probably problems first, followed by solutions, but we don't rule out the possibility that sometimes people invent a solution to which we have to find a problem. So innovation is how organizations respond to change, and that's at the biggest picture level, and that's whether you're in a for-profit organization, a not-for-profit organization, any kind of organization that is addressing new problems and new solutions is basically in the business of innovation. Now, I mentioned before that new problems require new solutions, and I'm emphasizing the word require for a reason that you'll see in a second. In fact, there's more cases than just new problems and new solutions. So we have to kind of step back slightly to understand the environment in which innovation is occurring. And I'll explain that now. There's 4 cases on this graph. So we have old problems, old solutions, and new solutions, and 4 possible combinations. The first one is very important because it's the quadrant that we want to avoid, and it's this stagnation quadrant. That's the situation where we have a new problem, like climate change, but we try to solve that by applying old solutions. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if we've identified that climate change is occurring, carbon emissions in the atmosphere are causing climate change, one possible solution would be to say, I know, we'll build more coal-fired power stations. Now, you might say, but you're insane, David. That's not going to solve the problem. And you're right. And that's why it's this stagnation quadrant. But we'd be surprised at the number of situations where people do try to solve new problems with old solutions, and it generally leads to stagnation. It goes backwards. I think it was Einstein who said that when you try to apply the same solution over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. And that's this quadrant here. It's the insanity quadrant because we're trying to reapply old solutions to new problems. The next quadrant that makes a bit more sense is this quadrant here, the old quadrant, solving old problems with old solutions, or we could say existing problems with existing solutions. Now that quadrant is actually very important. I call it the replication quadrant. And what it means is that a large part of any organization's business is its core business. It's doing what it does on a daily basis. It's current products, satisfying current needs. So for a lot of organizations, that may be 70, 80 more percentage of their core business, and that's how they make their money or satisfy their customers. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not really innovation. It's what sits beneath innovation. So it's important to understand that it's there. Now, the next 2 quadrants are the important ones for innovation. The first of those is that when we have existing problems to which we apply new solutions, then we're in the business of incrementation or incremental innovation. So basically we take an existing problem and solution but improve on it in some way, make it better, make it faster, make it cheaper, and as I said, we're in the business of incremental innovation. So there's kind of a pathway here from your core business up to incremental innovation, and not surprisingly then the next quadrant is the radical quadrant. Now I've used 2 terms here, redirection and reinitiation, as another way of describing this disruptive or radical innovation, but that's basically the radical quadrant. And that's the quadrant where we have new problems, take climate change again, to which we find that we have to apply new solutions. So the radical quadrant, the top right-hand quadrant, is really the only viable way that we can solve these new problems like climate change. We know it's no good applying old solutions. It's no good building more coal-fired power stations. That won't solve the problem. And it's not even any good just making the coal-fired power stations a little bit better, slightly improving their emissions, because ultimately they're still contributing to the problem. So we can't even solve the climate change problem by simply through incremental innovation with the existing solutions. We've really got to move to this radical quadrant, and that's why I say that new problems, at the end of the day, they demand new solutions if we want to solve the problem. Okay, and so we can think of the bottom 2 quadrants as really the sort of business of routine problem solving, and the top 2 quadrants, the incremental and the radical quadrants, as the business of creative problem solving. So those 2 slides so far tell us why we should innovate. One more explanation for why we should innovate, and then I'll move on. I like to use the example of improving crop yield. So in Australia, we do lots and lots of farming, so it's an important part of the economy. And you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the idea that if we want to increase the yield of a crop like wheat, we can put fertilizer on it. So in fact, that's an incremental solution. We can just plant the seeds in the ground and hope for the best. But if we want to incrementally improve the yield, that solution, we can apply fertilizer. So the first part of this curve you can think of as representing incremental innovation. Applying fertilizer, we apply a bit more, we get a greater crop yield. Now, what this also reveals is that incremental solutions, in fact, have a finite life. They don't work forever. And the reason they don't work forever is because of the concept of diminishing returns. So what happens, of course, is that if you keep putting fertilizer on a crop, eventually the payoff starts to decrease. And if you're unlucky, you can even kill the crop. So there's a point of negative returns where so much fertilizer damages the crop. So what this shows is that an incremental solution has a finite life. There's only so much value you can squeeze out of an incremental solution before it ceases to have any benefit. So if we want to be successful innovators and if we want to achieve sustained growth, organizations can't just rely, of course, on their core business. They can't just rely on incremental innovation. They have to do something as well, and they have to basically also move into radical innovation. What does that look like in this example? Well, what it means is that once you've squeezed as much value out of fertilizer as you can, and you've reached the point of diminishing returns, then you have to move on to a new solution to add on to that. And that's the example of radical innovation. We have to step out of this solution to a new solution. So we might say, okay, we put on just enough fertilizer to get the maximum value. Then what do we do next? What's the radical solution that keeps us moving forward? In this case, it could be irrigating the crop, watering it. But that solution also has a finite life. It's subject to the law of diminishing returns. So this is going to happen eventually. We drown the crop. So we know there's no point in just putting more and more and more water on the crop. The incremental solution doesn't work forever. So once we reach that point of diminishing returns, then again, we have to be ready with the next radical solution if we want to keep the growth moving forward in a steep, sustained way. So for example, we might apply some technology to how we put the seed in the ground, how we sow the seed. So it turns out that if you put a seed too deeply in the ground, it doesn't get enough water and doesn't grow. If you put it too shallow, the birds eat it or it blows away. So there's a kind of optimal depth for a seed. And some of my colleagues at the University of South Australia, for example, are designing new plough technology that puts the seed in a very precise position in the ground to maximize its growth. So you can see that by combining incremental innovations, fertilizer, irrigation, sowing, and improving each one of those incrementally, but then joining those incremental solutions together as a series of disruptive innovations, we can achieve this ongoing sustained growth. And so innovation overall really requires this combination of being able to both incrementally innovate and be disruptive innovators in order to achieve this sort of sustained steep growth. So, now, if you accept that that's true and you believe what I say about the driving forces behind innovation, then the next question, of course, is, so how do we do it? Great, I can achieve sustained steep growth and we're all going to be rich or have happy customers. What is the secret to making this happen? Now, I'll give you the kind of helicopter high-level view. Ronnie, for example, will drill into some more detail about this. But I want to tell you about three things. I want to discuss the dimensions of innovation, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I want to discuss the stages of innovation, and then most importantly, I want to show you how those two things combine together into a framework for innovation that basically becomes the roadmap for how we navigate this process of innovation and tells us how to achieve these incremental and disruptive innovations. I'm just going to have a sip of coffee for a moment. You guys can't see it over here, but there's a secret. It's like Harry Potter over here. There's a bookcase on a rail here that can move back and forward, so there's some sort of secret room out there. I'm going to look at afterwards. So what are the dimensions of innovation? There are four things in the psychology of creativity and innovation. There are four elements that we talk about, and each of which has a great deal of research has been conducted. And so we know a lot about these and how to measure them. We know a lot about the person in terms of feelings, motivation, and personal properties that contribute to creativity and innovation. We know a lot about the so-called press, meaning the pressure of the environment. So this is basically the culture, the leadership, the resources, the strategy, and so on that together support innovation. We know about the various processes, the cognitive processes, for example, that support innovation. And we also know how to recognize a creative product, what makes a product itself actually creative as opposed to a routine solution. Now, I'm not going to say too much more about those, but Ronnie will tell you more about some of the combinations of these. Two important things to say about it before I move on. The reason I've added the arrows the way I have is that these things function as a system. And like any system, there are properties that emerge through the interaction of the elements. So Ronnie will tell you about the interaction of people, the organizational culture, and the processes, in other words, teams, and how those three things together function as a system to deliver this capacity for innovation. So she'll talk more about that. The other important thing, was teams and the kind of systems nature of those dimensions. Now, the stages of innovation. There are various models of the stages of the innovation process. You may be familiar with some of them. I'm highlighting a very simple 4-stage model here, not because it's necessarily the right model, but just it gives you the kind of sense of the basic stages. So innovation occurs through a series of stages such as, first of all, recognizing that a problem exists, then generating ideas in order to try to solve that problem. But before we can solve it, then evaluating those different ideas. Some will be no good, they'll be too expensive or unfeasible. And ultimately then proceeding with a solution and validating, checking that solution actually works. So any model of innovation, you'll see different numbers of stages and different activities, but they say basically the same thing. Recognizing that a problem's there, generating ideas, evaluating those, and implementing the solution. So the important thing from our point of view, in terms of how innovation occurs, is combining those two things together. So combining the dimensions of innovation, the things that the people do, the climate, the culture, the processes that we use, and the stages of innovation. And a lot of my research in the last few years has been around this question of how do we combine those two things into a framework of innovation that really tells us what we need to do and when we need to do it to make innovation happen. That's contained in this diagram. Now, it's immediately kind of overwhelming, and there's a lot of information. So I don't want to spend 10 minutes just trying to explain this to you. I'll just point out the kind of key elements. Having told you that there are 4 stages of innovation, I'm now saying forget that. Actually, there are 7 stages of innovation, and these are the columns. So we have a stage of preparation, where we identify that a problem exists. We have stages like generation, which I mentioned before, and at the end, stages of implementing the solution. The rows in this diagram are the person, process, press, and product elements. So what I've done in this particular diagram, the concept behind it is to integrate those two things together, and it does one very important thing, which in summary is that it tells us what to do, but also when to do it. So we like to think that this model differs from other models in one important way, and that is that it identifies, it recognizes that innovation is not a one-step process, or we say it's not a one-size-fits-all process. It's a process where it matters what you do and when you do it. To illustrate that, I'll give you 2 very quick, simple examples. When you're in the idea generation stage and you're trying to think up lots of ideas, the core cognitive process is divergent thinking. So in that phase, we need to be divergent, or you might say creative thinkers. However, in the very next stage, where we have to start knocking out some of those solutions because they may not work, we have to use, if you like, the opposite kind of thinking, convergent thinking. So this seems to present a paradox. It seems to say that if you want to be a good innovator, you have to be able to think both divergently and convergently. And people sometimes say, yeah, but how can I do that simultaneously? It's a paradox. But the model reveals the fact that in fact it's not a paradox, because you do them at different times. So really the secret to effective innovation is knowing when to do these different things, when to activate the right processes. And the same applies to things like the organizational culture. So sometimes you need an organizational culture that's very open and relaxed and supportive and so on to facilitate the process. Other times you need a very demanding environment because you've got a schedule, you've got a product to deliver, so it's okay to be more high demand. And as I said, the secret then to effective innovation is doing the right thing at the right time across all of these dimensions, in the way that you think, in the climate that you set up, in the personal properties that you draw on, and so on. Okay, so the last question, and just to finish in a couple of minutes, is then how do we measure innovation? That previous diagram is nice, and it's very colourful, and people always sit up with interest and so on. But unless we can translate that into action, then it's still a theoretical model. And one very good way to translate that into action is to use that as the basis for measuring. So if we can measure what I described in the previous diagram, then we're in a position to do something about it. You all know what gets measured matters. So we need a measure of that model of innovation. And in fact, such a thing exists. I'll tell you very quickly about different approaches to innovation measurement, and then I'll tell you how we develop a measure of the previous model that I showed to you, which is the IPAI. So very quickly, there are two approaches to measuring innovation. We can start on the right-hand side at the output, or outcome if you like, and measure things like profit, market share, even numbers of ideas, patents, and so on. The problem with those is that they're output measures, or measures of performance. And like any output measure, it's a lagging measure, so it's a measure of what happened last quarter or last year, which is good, and you need to know it, but it's historical, and it means that there's nothing that you can do to change that. So we also need input measures of innovation. Unfortunately, those are the ones that tend not to exist. And the advantage of input measures is that they're measures of innovation capacity. They tell us what will happen in the future. So they're much more useful because they are the things that we can influence, and they tell us how innovative we're going to be or capable of being next quarter and next year. And because they haven't happened yet, they're the things that we can influence and develop. So we need more innovation capacity measures in addition to the output measures, and combined together, that's when we have all the information that we need to successfully lead the process of innovation. So the million-dollar question is still, that's great, David, but it's still theoretical. How do we do it? Well, the answer is that we took, some years ago, this framework of innovation that tells us what to do and when to do it, and developed from that an actual survey measuring instrument. And although you can't read it, it's even in Norwegian here. So I know terms like ikke ansatte, something, something, something. So I do know a little bit more Norwegian. And so we now have an instrument, and again, I won't go into great detail, but the instrument gives us a very detailed diagnosis of an organization's capacity for innovation across those phases that I mentioned and across the different dimensions. And for each intersection of a phase and a dimension, we get a percentage score that tells us how well aligned the organization is to the ideal conditions for innovation. We then have a method for color coding that, so that red, of course, means it's a weakness, green means it's a strength for that organization. So what it allows us to do is to then very precisely pinpoint where the organization is doing the right things that support innovation and where it's doing the wrong things. But it's the right things at the right time and the wrong things at the wrong time. So it doesn't necessarily mean everything's wrong in the organization. It may just mean that things have to be kind of realigned and matched up correctly. But the important point is that it gives us this very detailed measure. I think of it like it's like going to the hospital, and your head hurts and you're limping and so on, and you go into the emergency department initially, and they do a very quick kind of diagnosis that says, well, you need to go and see a brain surgeon, then you need to go and see a heart specialist, and so on. This is the emergency department diagnosis, but it allows us to say, who do you need to go and see? Do you need to go and see a cognitive process specialist to teach you how to think divergently? Do you need to see an organizational culture specialist who will help you fix an adverse culture, and so on and so on? I know I'm getting dirty looks from Miriam to stop talking, so I'll finish very soon. The other thing that it allows us to do is also to look at different groupings within the organization. For example, this is data from a study we did with an engineering firm. We can compare male and female employees on that measure of organizational innovation capacity. This is the overall scores. So we can see whether males are more innovative or have a greater innovation capacity than the females, or vice versa. More importantly, we can also understand why. And for example, I did a study recently that showed that a poor organizational culture was dragging the women down in particular and kind of suppressing their capacity for innovation. We can also look at different departments within the company. So this one, the engineering firm, engineering, finance, and HR, and so on and so on. And then you can explore why is it that the finance and HR people have a poor capacity for innovation while the service department has a higher capacity for innovation. So the instrument allows us to do all sorts of kind of analytical things to explore the data further. So what are the key takeaways? Firstly, that change drives incremental and radical innovation, and that those two things in combination really are the secret to sustained growth. We also know what the key capabilities of innovation are, those dimensions and also the stages. And most importantly, perhaps, we know that those key capabilities of innovation can be measured. And as soon as we can measure something, then we're in a position to do something about it, to manage it, change it, and optimize it. And with that, I'll shut up. So thank you very much. I think we've got maybe a couple of minutes for questions now before we move on. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have time for a few questions from the crowd. If you have any burning, yeah?
Yeah, well, you talked about culture. There are needs for different cultures at different stages within the framework of innovation. It's not so easy, in my experience, to change culture at all, let alone several times through an innovation process.
Yep.
Perhaps you can talk a little bit.
Well, it's a good question, and it really goes to the difference between maybe culture and climate. And I'd say, I mean, culture is the more, it's the atmosphere that's sort of less changeable, and climate is more the specific conditions. So in my opinion, it's like the environment, like outside here, that you've generally got a kind of temperate climate in Norway, but on any given day it can be warm or cold or raining or dry. And it's more the sort of day-to-day climate that is the thing that you try to change. So a company has a general culture, but within that you can shift, in sort of more subtle ways, the climate on any given day or in any given situation to be more or less favorable. So it's not necessarily saying that we have to kind of throw out the entire company culture. It's more that we have to kind of, modify it within certain constraints. Yes?
Talking about being able to measure innovation, but are you familiar with the Amos pause? That there can be half innovation and there's a lot of technology possibilities available for you, but it simply takes perhaps 5 to 10 years before you're able to take advantage of all those possibilities. So being able to measure right away innovation can be difficult because we see there a lot of times throughout history there is a span of 5 to 10 years before we're actually able to use that technology. So how do you take account of something like that?
Yeah. Well, you're right, and what the capacity measure is doing is looking at the things that are the sort of driving ingredients. So what you do with those ingredients and whether they lead to an innovation tomorrow or in 5 years' time, that's what I mean. To be honest, that's outside of the scope of what I do. What I'm concerned with is really how do you set up the right conditions that then make it possible for innovation to occur, most efficiently. But how that actually leads to innovations is another matter. But I mean, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. Sometimes it may lead to innovation very quickly. Other times it may have to kind of gestate for a long time. But at least if we know what things we're trying to foster and develop and manage, we're in a better position to create the conditions that will lead to innovation somewhere further down the track. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions afterwards as well, I think. So if anybody's got anything else you want to discuss, then we can do that.
Yes, so I would like to introduce our next speaker. Roni Reiter-Palmen is a creativity researcher who has been studying creativity for more than 20 years. 30 years, yes. And like David says, she is going to go a little bit more into creative work in teams and some of the cognitive processes that can create obstacles for creative teamwork, but that can also work as a benefit in creative collaborations. So Roni, please.
Thank you. I'm not going to even attempt to reach that. I'm too short. And I've been trying to keep up with these tall guys for the last week. Okay, so as Miriam mentioned, I'm Ronnie Reuter-Pullman. My training is in psychology. In fact, it's in industrial organizational, or the better way the European calls it, work psychology. But I'm also part of a center at our university for the study of collaboration and teamwork. So I want to talk about teams, and I want to talk about how teams have the capacity to be creative, can be creative, but it's not easy. So it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we'll talk a little bit about, start with the bad and get you depressed and hopefully then lift you up, because it really is a good story in the end. But before we go there, David talked about innovation and the fact that we can measure innovation. I want to talk a little bit about creativity. And again, just to preface this by saying that there's a debate, or not so much of a debate, kind of those, what do we mean when we say this, between creativity and innovation, and depending on who you read, they're interchangeable. Others say innovation is everything and creativity is the beginning part, and others, people say no, creativity is everything and innovation's the end part, and so I just started to use creativity and innovation as kind of one big word to satisfy everybody, because I really mean the process from beginning of recognizing that there is a problem to be solved all the way to implementation. So one of the things that happens particularly when you talk to people that have not studied creativity for 20 or 30 years, and I get people telling me, oh, we can't define creativity, we don't know what it is, it's too ambiguous. No, we've been defining creativity for a long time. There's a consensus about what creativity is, at least in the psychological research, which is an idea, a solution, a product, or a process. So basically anything that you can do as an organization that is both original or novel, and at the same time useful or appropriate. So if a solution solves the problem at hand and it's original, then we say it's a creative solution. So we need both, right? So a solution that is useful, but we've done it a million times, it's a routine solution. It's great, it works, that's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. A solution that is original, but not useful, has no place in an organization. What are we going to do with it? So for an organization's perspective, we're looking for solutions that are both original and useful at the same time. So as I said, I want to talk a little bit about disadvantages in teams. You've all worked in teams, I'm sure, and you've all had some really bad experiences. I have not talked to a single person that spent all their lives just working in wonderful teams. So there are a lot of things that can go wrong when we work in teams, and teams can be very, very frustrating. So why are teams frustrating? What happens? We have ineffective communication, or worse, lack of communication. People don't talk to each other, or talk to each other about the wrong things, right? So we talk about the weather, but not about the work that we need to do. Or we talk and we realize that we really don't understand each other. I thought you're going to do this part, and you thought I'm going to do the same part, and nothing gets done. Partly, what leads to this ineffective communication is the fact that there are multiple perspectives. We come from different backgrounds. For those, if you've been on an interdisciplinary team, my experience has been that we spent the first 3 to 6 months just figuring out, even though we all speak English, we speak a different language, right? So we have slightly different vocabularies, and we use one word to mean really 3 different things, and we need to figure it out. And we don't always realize it until we're right in the middle of a project. Okay. In part, ineffective communication occurs because we don't trust each other. So I'm not going to tell you everything that I know or share all the information because, it's important. If I keep some information for me, then I'm important, right? Or I don't trust you to use the information correctly. Teams have conflicts and disagreements. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? We can disagree about how to carry on a task, and that can be good because we'll talk about our differences, we'll solve the problem, we'll understand each other better, and that's okay. But disagreements can become incredibly difficult when they're personal. So, when I talk about this, the task conflict or the task disagreement is, I don't like your solution, I don't think this solution will work. The relationship disagreement or conflict is, I think you're an idiot, right? That's never good. That doesn't help anybody. One of the big issues with teams is that we have coordination costs. What do I mean by coordination costs? If you worked on a task all by yourself, you would go to your desk, you would sit at your computer, you would get the work done, and you'll be done with it. You work in a team, I need to do my part. You need to tell me to make sure that I do my part. You can't do anything until I finish and give it back to you. We need to coordinate who's doing what. There are days that I spend sitting in meetings 2/3 of the day, and then I haven't done all the work that comes out of those meetings. But those meetings are the coordination costs associated with working in teams. You can have dominant individuals. How many of you have been in a team where nobody else could talk except this one person that really talked all the time, right? Very frustrating. And you have social loafing. So I don't need to do any work. All of you guys are going to do all my work for me. So teams are bad. Okay, no, they're not. No, they're not. I actually like working in teams. I find the projects that I do that are team projects are more enjoyable. So why, with all of those frustrations, why do we use teams? Teams can be used to solve complex problems that cannot be solved by any one individual. And a lot of the problems that we're facing, whether it's climate change, or what's the next big innovation in a product, are complex problems. We need multiple perspectives to solve those complex problems. The reason one person alone cannot solve the problem is because we need those multiple perspectives. If you bring in, if you have a team and you have a new product that you're trying to get to market, it's important that you have not just the salespeople that are going to promise things that are impossible to do, but also the production people that would tell the salespeople, no, you can't promise that because it's impossible to do. You put us on a deadline that we can't keep. More people, more perspectives, more domain, more disciplines, more knowledge that we can bring into solving this problem. We could do more, right? More hands make the work light. That's the saying. So we could do more with more people. And we could capitalize on the strengths of different team members. So, if somebody's really, really organized, they can make sure that everybody else stays organized and keep those of us that are completely absent-minded on task. So, with that, we have complex problems, and we tend to solve them with teams that are diverse in terms of their backgrounds, knowledge, educational departments, and so forth. But those complex problems and that diversity in the team makeup makes all of those bad things about teams even worse. Communication is more difficult. Trust is harder to develop, etc. So the disadvantages are greater, but the advantages are greater as well. Okay? So it's really kind of a polarizing effect. It takes it and it makes it, whatever it is bigger. So we really need to know how to manage those diverse teams solving complex problems so that we could minimize the disadvantages and increase the advantages. So for that reason, I like to talk about how teams solve problems and talk about two things that we do in teams. One is social processes, the other is cognitive processes. Those are the processes that David talked about earlier, right? So the cognitive processes are the process circle, and that interaction between the person, the press, and the processes kind of fall in that social process. So let's talk about the social process first, then we'll move to the cognitive processes. So for a team to function well, we need to have trust and psychological safety. That is, people need to feel comfortable sharing information, telling other people their opinion, their thoughts. You know, if you just sit there because, you know, if I say something, people will think I'm stupid, or they're just going to discount what I say or not take me seriously, you're not going to share your point of view. We're missing on those multiple perspectives, right? That is an advantage of a team. So teams really need trust and psychological safety to work well. And that leads us to communication, right? So trust and psychological safety facilitate communication and information sharing in a team context, which is kind of the bottom layer, the foundation for effective teamwork. We require coordination and collaboration. We have multiple people, they're doing different things. We still need to put it all together into one coherent whole. There's conflict, that's kind of the bad side. You know, the positive aspect of it is that we need to know how to manage the conflict. You're going to put people in a room, there's going to be disagreement, that's inevitable. It's just how much, how do you manage it to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand and actually is helpful. And then teams can be very useful for learning and reflection. And that's a huge thing with creativity, because one of the big things is that creativity, you're going to make mistakes. You're trying something new. The important thing is to learn from it, reflect on it, make changes, try something else. So all of those exist in teams, and we have cognitive processes. The cool thing about cognitive processes is that they happen at the individual level, and then we aggregate them to the team level. So what I'm going to talk about here actually started at the individual level, and we've been doing some work on how this looks at the team level. And frankly, it's very similar, slightly different names, but really similar to the dimensions that David mentioned. So the first step is problem definition or problem construction. How do you define the problem? How do you know that a problem is there? And then how do you kind of decide what your goals are and what problem you're trying to solve for? Idea generation, which is actually something I'm not going to talk about, because you could go and Google brainstorming or idea generation. You'll get 1.5 million hits or something like that. It's been researched significantly. We know a lot about it. Idea evaluation and selection. I think one of the reasons people hate brainstorming is because, you know, a facilitator comes in, you brainstorm, you have 100 ideas, and then the facilitator leaves. And you're stuck with 100 ideas. And the important thing is you need to do the next step. What are those ideas? Which ones are good? Which ones are bad? Which ones do we keep? Which ones do we try to implement? And then you need to implement them. If it stays as an idea, if you choose a good idea, but it stays as an idea for the organization, then nothing happened. So you really need to plan for that implementation and think about it. So let's talk for a little bit about problem construction in teams. So I like to give this example of what problem construction is. So here's a very simple problem, probably the simplest problem you can find. There are mice in my basement. So how can we think about how to rephrase this problem, starting with how can I? Instead of saying there are mice in my basement, how can I, or how can we, sometimes with group problems. So with the mice, typically is, how can I get rid of the mice? So a good solution for getting rid of the mice is putting a mouse trap, right? Does that work to get rid of the mice if I put a mouse trap? Okay. But it's not the only way we can define this problem. You can also ask, how can I make sure that mice don't get into my basement in the first place? A mousetrap is not going to help me with that. That's not going to solve that problem. right? So I need to figure out how to seal my basement so the mice don't get in. Now, what you could see from this is, even with a simple problem, you have multiple ways of framing it. And the way you frame it leads you towards certain solutions and away from others. By the way, this particular problem, really interesting differences. When I talk to the business students, I always get at least one person saying, how can I make money off the mice? Okay, we came up with a mouse circus. And then the psychology students usually go, how can I learn to coexist with the mice? Okay, so background differences, matter in terms of how you frame the problem. And that's one of the things that we find with this phase is that your past experiences and your background do matter in what you consider. So another way to think about how you reframe the problem or do problem construction is think about goals. What's the purpose? What am I trying to solve for? What's my goal here? Or another way to also think about it are what are constraints or restrictions. So almost every project has a budget. So, the budget is a constraint. You can do whatever you want, but it has to fit within this price tag. So team members will have a different understanding of the problem that they're facing. And the issue is that we rarely talk about the fact that we don't understand the problem in the same way. So if you're trying to get rid of the mice and I'm trying to make money off the mice, we're going to come up with different solutions. We'll sit there in a meeting arguing about which solution is best when in fact we don't even agree on what the problem is. Okay? So it's really important to talk about what are we trying to solve for, and do we agree on that before we even try to get to a solution. So you need to discuss and share information. You need to get multiple perspectives. Now the cool thing is, when we do that and we start to take into account everybody's different perspectives, we get a richer, more complex understanding of the problem that allows us to come up with more creative ideas. But frankly, it allows us to solve the problem better. Even if you don't come up with a creative solution, you get a better solution regardless, which is really neat. So you must discuss those different conceptions of the problem. Okay, so idea evaluation. I said I'm going to skip idea generation. Idea evaluation, idea selection. Really important. You get 100 ideas, you need to narrow it down. The organization can't implement all of them. Not all of them are very good. So first of all, when we talk about idea evaluation, how do we know that an idea is a good one? What are the criteria against which we evaluate those ideas? And usually we identify them in the problem construction stage. I have a goal. I then measure my idea against that goal. Did I solve the problem I set out to solve? And again, those differences in perspectives will shape not only how we understand the problem, but also what criteria we use to evaluate an idea, to determine if it's a good idea, if it's a feasible idea, if it's an original idea, and so on. Now, where teams really make a huge difference, we find, is in that implementation. Because different perspectives, the production, the HR, the marketing, the sales, will come in with different perspectives, and they can think about different problems that will arise during the implementation phase. So the HR people are going to think about, how would our personnel react and what training do they need? And the sales people are going to think about the customers. And the marketing people are going to think about the marketing campaign and how to convince the customers they need the new product, and so on. They will bring in their different perspectives and think about different obstacles that we can plan for. And the more obstacles we plan for and have a solution for, the smoother that implementation will happen. Implementation falls apart when we see an obstacle and we didn't plan for it and we don't know what to do with it, and then we're standing there going, oh my God, what do we do now? So the cognitive processes, for the cognitive processes to happen effectively, and they are, again, the foundation of this creative problem solving, we really need to have the social processes in place. Without sharing information, without effective communication, without coordination, without effective management of conflict, all of those things will not happen. Those things create trust and psychological safety, or require trust and psychological safety, and in the end, allow us to communicate in the team, share information, and do those problem-solving processes. So the bottom line is that effective social processes are necessary, but not sufficient. You need those social processes to allow for the cognitive processes to happen. And you need the context. You need to have leadership in place that would facilitate those social processes. Leadership could also facilitate the cognitive processes, but where they're really effective is making sure that the team functions well. You need an organizational culture that allows for open and trusting communication, right? And facilitates those kinds of behaviors. You need the right people in place. So people that have the technical skills, the cognitive skills that I've talked about, and the social skills that I've talked about. You have to have people that are similar enough to one another that they can communicate, right? If we're sitting there and you guys didn't know English and I didn't know Norwegian, all of this could not happen. So you need to have some point of similarity so people can talk to one another, but they need to be different so we could bring in multiple perspectives. And we need to provide them training. One of the things that we see is that people think that, oh, you have good technical skills. I'll promote you to a leadership position. You don't know how to work with people or manage them. We'll take people from all these different departments and we'll throw them in the room and, somehow they'll come up with a creative solution. But they don't know how to deal with the social processes. And we can train for creativity. We know how to do that. We can improve creativity through training. So, all of those can be managed and developed. And that's where I'm at. So, thank you. Do we have time for questions? Okay, so time for a couple of questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Oni? If anybody wants to ask a question in Norwegian, I can also translate. Okay, we have a question in the back. Would you mind meeting me halfway and speaking into the mic so we get it for the people at home as well? Or I can just repeat it.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Lisa. I'm also American. I work with diversity.
Okay.
And then I was a little interested in your research on diverse teams, because you're talking about diversity as a, functional. Diversity.
Right.
What about cultural diversity?
Okay. Sure. So yes, there is research on that. What we find in general that cultural diversity functions very much like functional diversity, because people bring in very different perspectives about what the problem is and so forth, and it shapes all their past experiences. What is interesting about demographic diversity is that the research suggests that it really doesn't do anything for creativity. It's not helpful. It doesn't harm it, but it's not particularly helpful. So this is where, at least in the US, a lot of companies pay attention to diversity and they go, oh, we need teams that are diverse in terms of gender and race and so forth. It's more important to have different backgrounds in terms of education and function. That leads to much more improved creativity than the demographic diversity. Now, I still would think that you should have teams that are demographically diverse. I think it's just bad to have a team that's just all white males. But, it's not that important in terms of the creativity outcome. It has other implications, but not for creativity. Other questions?
I think we'll then just round off now, and then
Okay.
we'll have time for a round of questions.
Sure.
In the end. And now, to wrap up this morning, I would like to invite my colleague Marcus to the stage. Marcus represents Norway in the ISO committee developing the new standard for innovation management. And I think this process can be both challenging and demanding, but also an interesting insight into what happens when people from very diverse backgrounds come together to discuss innovation. So, Marcus?
Thank you.
Vil du ha et stativ?
Ingen applaus, setter veldig stor pris på det. Skal vi se. Nettopp, ja, så nå har vi vært gjennom flere konsepter på innovasjon, flere konsepter på kreativitet. Det som kommer fram her er jo at det er viktig at når vi jobber med kreativitet, når vi jobber med innovasjon, så må ting være strukturert, ting må være systematisk, ikke sant? Dette er mye av bakgrunnen for arbeidet med en internasjonal standard på innovasjon. Og mange tenker at liksom, en standard for innovasjon, det går vel ikke an. Altså kreativitet og innovasjon, det er jo noe som skal skje litt av seg selv og litt organisk og litt tilfeldig. Men en av de tingene som vi er mest enige om i ISO-arbeidet er at struktur er helt nødvendig for å jobbe innovativt. Og det er viktig også å si at dette arbeidet her baserer seg også på nasjonale standarder. Flere land har allerede utviklet egne nasjonale standarder, og det finnes en europeisk standard som er bakgrunnen for arbeidet. Så hvis vi er enige i at innovasjon er så viktig, så har vi vel lyst til å være med på dette arbeidet. Vi har med Sony Mobile, vi har med Ericsson, vår kjære svenske bror, vi har med Total, vi har med Airbus, store prestisjetunge selskaper som ser viktigheten av innovasjon, og som er villige til å bruke tid på prosessen med å lage en standard som skal egentlig hjelpe bedrifter i hele verden å finne ut hvordan de kan jobbe med innovasjon. Jeg har også tatt med landene som er med. Kina er selvfølgelig med, selv om i diskusjonene så sier de utrolig lite. Av og til så kommer de med noen innspill som egentlig ingen skjønner hvor kommer fra, og så må vi prøve å være veldig høflige og si at det skal vi selvfølgelig ta med. Japan er med, veldig tungt med, veldig opptatt av innovasjon, og har jobbet med å standardisere innovasjon i Japan lenge. Argentina er tungt med, de leder arbeidsgrupper som jeg sier. Og Frankrike er med. De er også litt sånn troublemakers selvfølgelig. Men kanskje viktigst for oss, Sverige er med. Svenskene er med. Da må vel Norge også klare å være med, ikke sant? Her er hele lista over de bedriftene som er med fra Norge i ingen spesiell rekkefølge. Så hvorfor er vi ikke med? Hvis vi snakker om at innovasjon er så viktig, hvis vi er så investert i at vi må sette innovasjon på agendaen, og norske bedrifter må innovere og så videre. Er det fordi vi er på hytta? Er hyttekos viktigere enn innovasjon i Norge? Eller har det kanskje å gjøre med oljen, at vi er blitt complacent? En av de mest interessante funnene, eller en av de mest interessante tingene som vi er enige om, og som har kommet fram i arbeidet med ISO-standarden, er at det er en deling i verden, ikke bare i Norge, eller i Frankrike eller Japan, men i verden, mellom bedrifter som investerer i innovasjon og vet hvordan de skal gjøre det, og bedrifter som ikke investerer i innovasjon, eller bare ikke aner hva de skal finne på. Og dette er også mye av bakgrunnen for det arbeidet vi gjør i Tinker, fordi det finnes masse informasjon, masse forskning, masse best practice på hvordan man kan jobbe med innovasjon. Det vi prøver å gjøre er å få flere av de som er nede i venstre hjørne over mot høyresida. At flere skal forstå hvordan de kan investere i innovasjon, og hvordan de kan få det til, og begynne å jobbe med det. Og igjen, dette er også bakgrunnen for det vi prøver å gjøre i standarden. Så, første ting vi er enige om, dette har jeg snakket om, innovasjon trenger struktur. Den kreative prosessen, innovasjonsprosessen, har behov for etablerte strukturer og systemer. Viktig å si, det betyr ikke at det er statisk. Selvfølgelig gjør det ikke det. Men når du har en struktur, når du har et system, så har du også et utgangspunkt for å forandre måten du forholder deg til kreativitet, til innovasjon. Enighet nummer 2. Kreativitet er helt essensielt for innovasjon. Og her er det viktig å si at når vi snakker om kreativitet i ISO-komiteen, så handler det ikke nødvendigvis om bare den første delen av innovasjonsfasen. Det handler om hele innovasjonsprosessen. Altså kreativitet er viktig i alle steg. Både når du skal finne interessante problemer å løse, og når du skal rulle ut løsninga di. Sant? Likevel så er det sånn at når man snakker om innovasjon som et rammeverk, så er kreativitet viktigst, også i ISO-standarden og i forskninga, i de tidlige delene av innovasjonsprosessen. Hvorfor er det så viktig? Jo, som Christian var inne på, så er det noe med at hvis ideen du velger definerer en så stor del av inntjeningspotensialet, og definerer en så stor del av kostnaden, så er det ekstremt viktig at man klarer å finne de beste ideene å satse på. Dette er et prinsipp som blir tydeligere og tydeligere også i teksten i standarden, at man må investere i den tidlige fasen av innovasjon. Så, det er 2 enigheter. Så jeg skulle ta noen uenigheter også, og der fikk vi ikke med hele teksten. Her står det innovasjonsstrategi eller innovasjonsstrategier. Og for meg så er dette her et ganske fascinerende poeng. En del av standardteksten handler om strategi. Og diskusjonen har egentlig hele tiden gått rundt innovasjonsstrategi som en måte å nå innovasjonsmål. Men på forrige samling i Madrid så kom Frankrike og Portugal med følgende forslag. Ok, så vi har innovasjonsstrategier som vi bruker for å nå innovasjonsmål, men det finnes noe over der som også er en sånn innovasjonsstrategi som er mer generell. Og for å være helt ærlig så forklarte det ikke det noe særlig nærmere enn det. Og da har vi på en måte en evig loop, for da har vi innovasjonsstrategi som er en plan for å nå innovasjonsmål. Så har vi en innovasjonsplan over der igjen, da må vi vel ha noen mål over det igjen, og så videre. Et åpenbart logisk problem, og vi, Skandinavia, svenskene og jeg, protesterte høylytt, men til slutt, ved avstemning, så ble det altså 3 nivåer. Innovasjonsstrategi, innovasjonsmål og innovasjonsstrategier. Jeg lover å jobbe for å endre på det her, dette er jo helt absurd. Men det viktige poenget her er at vi omgir oss med en type mytologi rundt innovasjon, ikke sant? Hvis noen sa til dere sånn, ja, vi skal ha en plan, skal vi ha en mål, skal vi ha en plan til over målene i hierarkiet, så vil dere tenke, det her er jo helt absurd, hva er det du snakker om? Sant? Men fordi at innovasjon fortsatt har et sånn snev av mytologi, tror jeg at vi tillater oss å tenke på innovasjonsstrategi som noe mytisk, noe spesielt som kommer fra San Francisco. Sånn er det ikke. Vi må ned på det rasjonelle og på det håndgripelige. Uenighet nummer 2. Sertifisering eller guidance. En standard er vanligvis enten sertifiserbar eller en veiledningsstandard. Right. Så en sertifiseringsstandard er noe som sier hva du må gjøre, mens en veiledningsstandard sier noe om hva du burde gjøre. Kina, Argentina vil veldig gjerne at det skal være en sertifiseringsstandard. Vi som er litt mer sånn fleksibel og ikke så firkantig, tenker at det er kanskje viktigere at det er en guidance-standard. For selv om det er prinsipper for innovasjon, prinsipper for kreativitet, som er viktige, og som er universelle, som vil gjelde uansett om du er en oppstartsbedrift eller et stort konsern, så er det også sånn at det er store variasjoner innenfor hvordan man jobber med innovasjon. Og kanskje noen av de tingene som du bør vektlegge når du har 5000 ansatte som er annerledes enn når du er 5. Derfor jobber vi for at det skal bli en guidance-standard først, før det blir en sertifiseringsstandard. Så tenkte jeg å ta med her, jeg vet ikke om dere klarer å lese hva teksten her er. Det står, det er så mange stavefeil, eller grammatiske feil i ISO TC 279 og så videre, at de ikke kan vises. Velg stavekontroll og grammatikk og så videre. Dette er fra et dokument som en oppsamling av alle kommentarene vi fikk på det første utkastet til standarden. Så utkastet var på 25 sider. Dette dokumentet er på 160 sider, med bare kommentarer som sier sånn, jeg forstår ikke dette ordet, eller flytt på dette kommaet, og så videre. Jeg har med denne sliden fordi at selv om det er veldig stor enighet rundt hva innovasjon er, og spesielt når det gjelder de store linjene, både i forskninga og i praksis, og mellom ulike land og ulike fagområder, så det er også sånn at det er mange ting som man er uenig om når det kommer til detaljnivået. Ikke sant? Og for oss i Tinker så dette et viktig poeng, fordi vi ser at det et behov for en større tydelighet i forhold til innovasjon. Dere har sett noe av forskningen som presentert av David og som presentert av Ronny, og noen av de måter man kan tenke rundt innovasjon på. Og vi har også vår egen modell som en syntese av de modellene og de rammeverkene som finnes der ute, som drar både på forskningen, på arbeidet som skjer i ISO og på best practice ellers i verden. Og det viktigste ikke nødvendigvis å velge en riktig modell. Det viktigste å ha en modell. Det viktigste å ha en struktur og ha en prosess. Så mangfold og forskjellighet kan både være en driver og et hinder for innovasjon, enten det gjelder standardisering eller det gjelder kreativ prosess. Arbeidet i ISO-komiteen fortsetter. Hvis noen av dere er interessert i å vite mer om det, ta gjerne kontakt. Skulle gjerne hatt noen flere nordmenn med. That's it. Skal vi se. Vi fikk nettopp. Så i utgangspunktet så skulle standarden publiseres i Q2 2019, men ISO har bestemt seg for at dette kommer til å bli en såkalt bestseller-standard. Så de har bestemt seg for at vi må bli ferdige tidligere. Så estimatet nå Q2, altså andre kvartal 2018. Så vær forberedt. Mer enn 50 000 bedrifter kommer til å lese dette dokumentet som et utgangspunkt for å tenke rundt innovasjon. Dette ikke uviktig. Ja, vær så god.
Jeg vet ikke om det er opplagt i forhold til den veilednings- og sertifiseringen noe dere allerede har argumentert med. Men erfaring viser jo for eksempel i sertifisering på sånn grønne verdier og slikt, at hvis du ser på sånn å bli stemplet som økologisk, for eksempel er det mange små vinmerker og lignende som ikke kommer med fordi de ikke har råd til sertifiseringen. Og i den grad mye innovasjon kommer fra SMB, det finnes jo masse undersøkelser på at mye av den store innovasjonen vil ikke et godt argument være at mange av de mest innovasjonsdrivende ikke vil ha råd eller mulighet til å jobbe med en slik sertifisering, eller er det veldig opplagt?
Altså, absolutt, det er et veldig godt argument, og i forhold til små og mellomstore bedrifter så er det en av de tingene som jeg pusher veldig for. Fordi at veldig mange av de som er representanter der som har råd til å være med, og som også har råd til å bli sertifisert eventuelt senere, er jo store selskaper. Sant? Så veldig mye diskusjon dras jo inn i en retning hvor man begynner å snakke om innovasjon som et fenomen som finnes på type konsernnivåer i veldig store organisasjoner. Men akkurat som det poenget du nettopp gjorde, veldig mye av innovasjon skjer i mye mindre enheter av organisasjoner. Så en av de perspektivene som jeg prøver å dytte på er at vi må skrive en standard som kan være relevant for store selskaper, men formuleringen i standarden må også være sånn at den kan være relevant for oppstartsselskaper, for mindre selskaper, som kanskje har en veldig spesifikt innovasjonsfokus. Sant? Og hvis du da skal lage en sertifiseringsstandard, så tror jeg den vil bli nesten paradoksal i den forstand at du vil på en måte pålegge folk å gjøre noen ting som du da må definere ganske vagt for at det skal passe til en så bred målgruppe. Vær så god.
Hvordan kvalifiserer man de som får være med å lage standard? Hvem er det som representerer de ulike landene? Er det bare bedrifter, eller er det stater også?
Ok, så måten det er organisert på er at de fleste land har en liksom, standardiseringsbody, i mangel på et bedre ord, som produserer standarder nasjonalt. Sant? Disse standardorganisasjonene har ansvar for å lage en speilkomité som skal følge prosessen, altså ISO-prosessen, med representanter nasjonalt. Og gi tilbakemelding på standarddokumentet som en representant har med seg inn i komiteen og typisk argumenterer ut ifra. Men i forhold til kompetanse så er det jo sånn at, og det er en av de tingene som har frustrert meg litt, er at som jeg sa, det er veldig mange store bedrifter som er med, store bedrifter som har innovasjonssystemer på plass. Det er få små, det er noen få folk som jobber som konsulenter innenfor innovasjon, og så er det en del folk som egentlig ikke er gode på innovasjon, men som er gode på standarder. Og sånn som det frustrasjonspunktet som jeg hadde tidligere her i forhold til innovasjonsstrategi versus innovasjonsstrategier, uten å nevne navn, så er det sånn at de som måtte fremme det poenget, er folk som ikke egentlig har peiling på innovasjon, men som er veldig gode på standardisering og på standarder. Sant? Så du kan si at altså, målet i sammensetningen er å på en måte få med akademia, offentlig sektor, humanitær sektor, små og store bedrifter osv. Men resultatet blir jo ikke nødvendigvis sånn. Sånn at jeg tenker at en av de store utfordringene i ISO-komiteen er å på en måte balansere det mangfoldet da, på en hensiktsmessig måte, sånn at alle de ulike aspektene som er relevant for standarden får en plass. Og der tenker jeg jo igjen altså at et norsk perspektiv, et sterkere norsk perspektiv, at det ikke kun meg, hadde vært nyttig. Det er i utgangspunktet ingen begrensning. Måten jeg ble med på var at jeg deltok på et møte som Standard Norge organiserte. Fikk nyss om prosjektet, registrerte meg først som frivillig, og så på bakgrunn av erfaring og relevant kompetanse ble registrert som et medlem i komiteen. Uten å gå for mye i detalj, så er det liksom et problem for min del å delta er at arbeidet må ha på plass på en måte norsk legitimitet i forhold til å ha med Standard Norge og så videre. Har gjort at det i perioder har vært aktuelt for meg å vurdere å bli med i den argentinske komiteen i stedet. Fordi at å få støtte til å være med fra Norge har vært ekstremt vanskelig. Og i lys av det vi har snakket om, med innovasjon som så selvfølgelig viktig, ikke sant? Og den enorme omtalen av innovasjon i Norge, så synes det for meg helt absurd. Er det bare et liksom, vikarierende ord vi bruker? Er det noe vi bare smykker oss med, eller er vi faktisk seriøse om å innovere? Jeg tenker, vi har 5 minutter igjen. Jeg tenker, hvis det er noen som har noen flere spørsmål, tror du ikke det? Til forskerne, så hadde det vært interessant.
Yeah, I'm interested to know about how improvisation plays into creativity and innovation. So, what research is out there? What can you guys tell us about?
Sure. So there is some research in general about improvising and creativity, but there's also some research about taking principles of improvisation and applying them in to organizations and finding that they are facilitating of creativity. So the issue with improvisation is that you need to be attentive to what the other person is doing, right? So you could take that and move that forward. And you need to be comfortable with going in, not knowing what we're going to do, right? Because it's going to happen as on the spot, which is incredibly difficult, particularly in organizations where we like our routines. But it is possible, and it does show positive effects.
Do you have, just as a follow-up, do you have any sort of methodologies or hows to do it?
I do not. That's not an area that I study, but I know the research is out there. So.
Well, if no one else has a question, I would like to ask you both the question. Sure. I'm just curious if you have come across in your research like any very obvious common pressure points, whether it's in the process or in the teamwork, where you see that across different industries that people struggle. Like, so if I were to say today, well, I'm not going to invest a lot of money in identifying where I should make my major investments, is there anywhere like I could put some money and get a good return of investment?
I'll go first just to give you rest. So my answer to that is that the instrument that I've developed we've done studies of school teachers, so a school as a place of innovation, local government, engineering firms, and they have a remarkably similar profile on that instrument. They're all generally, they're better at the implementation phase, and where they struggle is in the creative front end that Christian mentioned. And in particular, again, across the board, the thing that is weakening their ability with the creative front end is that they don't know how to think divergently, and the organizational environment doesn't support that. And that's sort of a remarkably consistent pattern across all sorts of different kinds of organizations. So if I was going to say, you know, the one thing you could do if you have limited resources and you want to try and improve this, even before you see that kind of measure, is teach people how to think divergently, support them in doing that, but don't forget that you also, you know, you're not trying to stop them being analytical, you're just trying to boost their ability to think divergently.
I would add that a great place to intervene is in that first problem construction, problem definition phase. As I said, it sets the stage for everything else. So if you do that in a very closed manner, a very simplistic manner, you're going to gravitate toward routine, simplistic solutions. There's actually quite a bit of evidence that shows, research evidence that shows, both in terms of just generally when we impact that process, everything else is influenced and improved, but also looking at training. The most bang for the buck, if you will, is when you train the problem construction process. That's where you really get the most influence on creativity. And related to what David said, I think this organizational culture, just in general, the really wanting creativity. One of my biggest frustration is that I'll have an organization come to me, ask for my expertise, and then when I tell them these are the things you need to do to be a creative, innovative organization, and they go, "Oh, we can't do that. No, we can't do that either. No, we can't." You know, it's like, okay, if you're serious about it, then there are things that you do need to change.
Sorry, just to add to that, we were talking yesterday, and you know, I do work with companies in Australia, and you often hear this phrase of, "Oh, you know, we're kind of too busy right now," and you want to say to them, "So you're too busy to innovate?" And you think, but you know, in my head, I think to myself, well, those are the zombie companies, what I call the zombie companies, because they don't know they're dead. But you know they are. It's just it may take 6 months or a year for them to realize that they are actually dead in business terms, but they don't know it yet. So.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming today. We are going to hang around and have a cup of coffee. So if you have any questions for the researcher or the rest of the team, please stay around and grab a coffee with us. Yeah, thanks.